I think I was probably the youngest person in coordination, and every time that we had a demonstration, I would always go straight home and I would record the news on my VCR, the footage that I put up on YouTube, that's not even half of the footage that I have. There's still a lot of stuff that has not been put up on YouTube. But I felt that it was really important that the history be preserved. And actually the footage sat on VHS tapes until about 2008. And it was in 2008 that I started putting it into a digital format and putting it online. And that was at a request of John Paul Barnick. John Paul Barnick really stayed on me. And he was really concerned about our history being represented in a truthful way. And he felt it was very important that we put that information out there for the public to see. So I was happy to do that. And like I said, there's still a lot more that I have not put up online yet, but I will be in the future.
Well, I just, can you hear me? Can you hear
yes,
me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Could you tell the story about how they were miraculously saved from the shed in Texas?
Well, after coordination disbanded, I was homeless for about 5 years. And while I was in college, and the tapes actually sat for 5 years in a shed out behind a friend's house for 5 years in the Texas heat. So it's really amazing that the tapes survived it all, because they. But I was always really careful not to play them. I was afraid that they would decompose. So yeah, I preserved them until it was time to digitize them and put them online. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of footage that you don't see. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. There was the Guns N' Roses demonstration. I had footage from that at the summit, and I haven't put that up online yet. There was people with immune system disorders. That was an affinity group of coordination, PIST, people with immune system disorders. And we would go to the local high schools and junior highs, and we would pass out safe sex literature and condoms to the children getting out of school. In fact, one time we were at Lanier Middle School passing out condoms and literature on the sidewalk, and the police came up and said that if we didn't disband, we would be arrested. And of course we didn't. We stayed there, and we were like, we have right to the sidewalk, and we're not doing anything wrong, so we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And when the police tried to remove us, it was Brian Bradley. He started chanting, "Silence equals death, action equals life." And all the junior high students started chanting it as well. It caught on. And it became, we were surrounded by all these junior high students, and they were all chanting it. And the police left us alone. They backed off. I have footage from the David Duke rally in League City when David Duke was running for president, and we interrupted his speech. Brian Bradley stood up with a big giant banner that said, "Nazi go home." And we marched out and started demonstrating out front. Anita Bryant came to town for a book signing at a Baptist bookstore, Bible Baptist bookstore, and we all attended that and tossed oranges at her. That's the Basic Instinct demonstration, and of course the footage from the Republican National Convention. Just to name a few.
So David, are there any plans to continue to digitize these files?
Yes, I will continue to, and actually, I'll continue putting this stuff up online. And I'm glad that there's an interest in it. I felt like it was really important history, and it was a story that people should know about, and people should have the access to the information. Yeah, so I'm happy to be here.
Okay. Thanks, David. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I would like to have David Fowler begin discussing the formation of Coronation, because while Paul Broussard, he was murdered in July of 1991, Coronation had been formed well prior to that, I believe, by the end of 1990. And both Susan and I came around just a bit after it was created. So David Fowler is the person up here who is sort of formative in its founding.
Thank you, Paul. Anyway, can you all hear me?
You got to pick it up, yeah.
Anyway, I sure aged from 25 years ago, haven't I?
Don't call their attention.
Anyway, we actually, what happened was ACT UP was getting real big because of the AIDS crisis in, of course, the United States. But in Houston, we didn't have access to that DBA, so we could not use it because somebody else in the city had taken that DBA. It was very difficult to work with at the time. So I looked around to see what was going on in the city, and I looked at New York, and New York had formed a group called Queer Nation. So I got together with Brian Bradley and John Paul Barnes. I said, what do we do? And John Paul said, why don't we just meet at my house? So we started meeting at his house at about 5 or 6 of us. And after that happened, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. But when Paul was murdered, it just blew up. We had to actually rent a building so we could have our meetings. And it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. We got a lot of participation. And we did all our own advertising. We made our own T-shirts. We made our own stickers. Everything was done by us. I want to tell you one thing. We used to, you know, the Houston Post. You all remember the Houston Post, right? We used to take those papers in the morning. We'd get about 5 o'clock, about 5 of us, and we'd go get those papers and open the boxes, and we'd take, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. We'd stick them right in the front of the sports section and put them right back in the box. And all these guys and girls bought these papers. That's the first thing they would see when they went to the sports section, was that. You know, we were painting on the sidewalk, silence equals death, you know, and things like that. And I remember the Montrose Voice that used to be in existence. Billy Duncan, who was a good friend of mine, used to work there. And me and my friend Tony Bell, we'd get in my car, and we'd take this big pink paint with a stencil and go around spraying this all over the sidewalks. We did the Boy Scouts, we did in front of people's houses, you know, we did that with bigots and homophobes. We did all that, and then what happened is Billy Duncan called me and she goes, who's doing all this stuff with that paint? And I said, I don't have the faintest idea, Billy. You know, I don't know what's going on, because my car was covered in big paint. You know. If she ever saw my car, she would know. But we did stuff like that just to get the word out and get noticed, you know. Basically, you had your people, as was mentioned, I think, in one of the videos, that wanted to sit at the table and discuss this stuff. We said, we're not doing that. We didn't get anywhere doing that sort of thing. We were going to hit the streets. And that's what we did, and that's where we got our attention. Now, as far as the Houston police goes, we always called them and let them know what we were going to do, because we wanted them there to protect us. Not for any other reason but that. We wanted them there to protect us. And they would show up, and I don't believe a lot of people ever got arrested for doing any of our demonstrations, you know. Now, the one that, the Paul Broussard one, that night, that Saturday night, I think you all remember that too. That was not planned. When that was planned to march from by Heaven over there around Mary's and come up that street and go down Westheimer to Montrose Boulevard and break up. But we saw the crowd, Gary Grant and I, bless his heart, Gary Grant and I said, well, let's just keep going. And what we did was we circled in that whole block, and no cars could get anywhere. They were stuck there for like 3 hours. They couldn't get through anything. And it was just wonderful. I mean, to show that much solidarity with all of us, it was just a great time to be. Now, that went on and on and on, and we kept doing stuff like guys and girls would go to Foley's and lay in the beds together and stuff, you know, and things like that. We did some crazy stuff like that. We did a lot of different demonstrations. I think Paul mentioned a few of them. There's a few mentioned in that video. But it went on and on. It got very big, the organization did. It went on for, like, I'd say about 3 years. And then, of course, people were passing away because of the epidemic, and we were losing people. I had to go start building my career because I had to make a living. And I did that. And then a lot of people, you know, just left. They left town or ever moved away. David Embry moved to San Francisco. David Westerkamp moved to San Francisco. And, you know, so it started splitting up. So I don't really know what happened after like 3 years after it was formed, if it kept going or didn't. I don't know. Maybe you can talk about that. We were there later. But anyway, we had a good time. We were glad that a lot of you people here were there then. You know, a lot of you younger people could learn a lot from this, because this was a great time in the community, for the gay and lesbian community here in Houston. You know, we had never seen anything that big. That night that we did that march, we knew we had finally had our ground. Finally, we were getting noticed. We had every news camera there was in the parking lot there in Montrose and Westheimer. Another thing I want to say is, we were in the New York Times, we were in Newsweek magazine, we were in USA Today, the Houston Post, the Houston Chronicle. We did every media thing that was going on. Houston was mentioned with our names, it's Queer Nation, in all those national papers. And it was just a wonderful time. You know, we didn't wish we had to do that sort of thing, but it's the only way we were going to get attention on the issue. And of course, Ray was a big help in all that, you know, because his dealings with the police department and everything. So But anyway, hopefully we don't have to do that again. I want to say another thing. Gay marriage was not an issue. We never even talked about it. You know, 25 years ago, it wasn't even in our minds, you know, and look where we've come today. So, you know, we've done a lot of good, and I think, you know, that we'll be remembered for this. And what David said is he wants to preserve this because we all need to remember what happened. So the young people coming up now, if we ever get another chance to do something like this, we have to, they'll know what to do. You know, so hopefully we can help anybody out. Okay.
I think a lot of one of the reasons why we kind of faded out as we moved into, about 1994?
1993.
Was it the 92 convention just exhausted us? I mean, we lost some people certainly, and people moved, but another issue was just simply that we had done work for so many years, and we were just exhausted. I think it took me 6 weeks just to get over the RNC in 92. I did want to talk a little bit about this clip, or the one just beyond. We did have an action after this also, after that amazing action, where we went out to the woodlands. We'll have to find that clip. Went in our cars, went out to the woodlands in front of a Kroger's out there, and read statements. Yeah, carried a casket, God, yes. And had 3 or 4 different spokespeople, and that would be a good clip also, because it would continue that. It also got us out of Houston inner city, out in the world. But I really do, like David, I really do hope that that in-your-face kind of action does get a little bit more attention. Second wave was very, very important. We couldn't be quiet. We couldn't hide that much more. At least some of us couldn't. And the in-your-face action forced people to, they didn't have to like us, but see us. And we were so many different types of people. But it was very interesting. I always called it a very exciting, very scary, beautiful kind of time. And I think I drank so much Pepto-Bismol before every action. I have pictures of me. I have just little bottles of Pepto-Bismol because I knew we needed to do it, but my entire body was just reacting to that kind of fear and adrenaline. But it eventually just wears you out. You know, so exciting time, but a new wave needed to step in.
I just want to say one more thing. We did have a big response from the straight community also. I mean, there were people there with their baby carriages, you know, husbands and wives and single mothers and stuff like that. They were very supportive of what we were doing. So it wasn't just us, you know, mostly us, but we had a lot of support from the straight community.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak for a little bit about sort of the overall national trajectory of coronation and ACT UP, because that impacted what happened in Houston. You know, David Fowler had been one of the founders of coronation probably at the end of 1990, and I came around probably a month after that. One of the first meetings I was at someone's house, John Paul Barnish's house, I believe, in January of '91, and so that's when I became involved. Now, coronation in New York had actually formed out of, I believe, a wave of hate crimes, including the murder of a guy named James Zappalordi, if I recall. And so the kind of violence that you saw here in Houston was being seen elsewhere around the country. You know, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force had begun collecting statistics on bias crimes beginning about 1985. And from about 1986 through 1990, you can see like an overall significant increase in the number of these crimes. And of course, we were all aware of this. You know, we lived in the city. Walking home from the gay bars on Pacific Street could always be a scary, very exciting experience. And we were paying attention to what was being reported in the gay and lesbian, the LGBT community news sources. And so we're like highly aware of this wave of violence. So that's part of how coronation arose in New York, and that was obviously part of how coronation became such a large organization here in Houston. You know, as I recall it, coronation in Houston was getting fairly large even prior to Paul Broussard's murder, and then after that it just sort of like grew even further in size. Now, I was not actually, I became most heavily involved as an organizer in coronation probably towards the end of 1991, because I began coordinating with people from around the country, mostly ACT UP chapters in Dallas, Kansas City, Chicago, Seattle, and Los Angeles, to coordinate protests and demonstrations and other actions around the Republican National Convention, which was going to happen in August of 1992. So, you know, in talking to those folks from those cities and getting a sense as to what's occurring nationally around the country, you know, chapters of ACT UP and coronation, there were about at least 125 of them, maybe up to 150. Some cities around the country had chapters of both organizations. Some cities had chapters of only one of those organizations. And so I would say, you know, easily, Larry Kramer once said that ACT UP worked with basically 10,000 people. And you know, Larry Kramer is an invertebrate New Yorker and East Coaster, and he doesn't know anything that happens outside of New York. So that basically means 10,000 people in New York. And I would guess that there's probably tens of thousands of more elsewhere around the country. So there's about 25,000, 30,000 folks in the organized core of this movement in these different cities amongst these 125, 150 chapters or so. So we're not just an organization that's in Houston, right? We're certainly a manifestation of what's happening locally. We're also part of a movement that's national, it's mass, it's very grassroots. You know, ACT UP did not have a nonprofit 501c3 status. We didn't do any of that. And it was, so, yeah, it's about more than Houston. It is genuinely a mass national movement.
Since the early 50s. 14 people got together for a demonstration at the White House led by Barbara Gettings and Frank Kameny. Frank would later say there was more than 20, but you can count them if you see the film. And if the guy with the camera had one assistant, there were 14, because there were 12 people marching around in a circle. It is their nature to do two things. To be seen publicly, that's why we need cameras, and to see one another. That's what we need for reinforcement and encouragement. After that beginning, it took us 20 years to get to the point where we started registering voters and putting their names on lists. But the biggest direct action grassroots movement have been the marches on Washington. The first one called by Harvey Milk, followed by a grassroots movement to decide what are the demands. Every time we do that, it gets a little less grassroots and a little less direct action. I happened to chair the 1979 March on Washington, but by 1983 it was bureaucracy. By 87 it was bureaucracy. In 93, it was basically a movement to raise some money for one organization or another. If you want to keep your direct grassroots organization pure, you do what Paul did for Houston Queer Nation. You make damn sure that titles rotate. You can chair for this meeting, you may even chair for next meeting, but by the third meeting it's time to replace the chair. So that you don't create a hierarchy, so that you have to deal with egos to cloud the vision of your focus. And that's not only true of that, it's true of all of the organizations. I remember the founding of Montrose Counseling Center, this great place that we're in now. It was a handful of people in a room not worried about titles, but worried about aiming the purpose. Grassroots movements are inherently and severely democratic, and they do two things. Now, to say the Paul Broussard demonstration at the corner of West Arm and Montrose was not entirely spontaneous, I have to say that somebody had to line up 3 television cameras, trucks, one right beside another, and I dealt with Dale Brown all night that night. He said, "When do you want me to stop traffic?" And I said, "I don't want you to, because I want people cursing us through the windows of their cars because they can't get through the intersection." That was all part of the story. We solved that case not because of the police investigation. We solved that case because the community came together and made that a front page headline story on all of the media for 2 solid weeks. And that takes a lot of work. Takes a lot of bodies. Takes a lot of people out there making it happen. The case was solved. All 10 of them got indicted. And this story said some was indicted for murder and some was 10. No, all 10 got indicted for murder. Of that, 7 went to prison. 3 got probation. One of the probationers lives with his lover just a few blocks from where the incident happened. But I'll wait until that documentary comes out sometime next year so you can see that. Any other questions from the audience for the panel? Yes, sir.
More of a comment. David Miller, Queer Nation member.
Hey, David.
Just a few things. I remember very well the founding of Queer Nation, and also little comments about its eventual dissolution. But principally about the demographics of the group, which were the same demographics as AIDS at that time, which was everyone. So there were women, men, young people, older people, attorneys, students, people of every ethnicity and every color and every background, and income level and so forth. It was a circus, as David pointed out. In other words, going and pouring motor oil inside a box of 3 green sheet newspapers, which specifically forbade some kind of same-sex personal ads or something like that. So we get a whole lot of used motor oil and pour those inside the box. That was one of the tactics. Going into Randall's supermarket at Westheimer and Shepherd, which had removed one of its employees from their insurance rolls when it turned out that he developed AIDS, and we go in with pots and pans, like this is like, French Revolution in 1789, and bang our way through the store and make a ruckus, and it was fascinating to see the shoppers get frozen. So it was a circus. So unlike the great documentary How to Survive a Plague, Queer Nation had a very rangy quality. We did not have like a tactical wing. And the comments of Ray about how you change leadership in each meeting, that was absolutely true. And there were a dozen people who were gifted leaders, and then kind of a really rowdy, conflicted, multi-agended body of people who were ready to do this extraordinary thing, which is trust each other, go out in the street, and lie down in an intersection. That's a bomb. And I think most of us still remember that as one of the great gifts of that. But, so there's this rangy, wild group of people, circus sometimes, atmosphere. You have this incredible challenge. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Palestinian activist about this the other day. How do you get the message out? Because reporters are going to come up to everybody in the protest and say, okay, so what are you here for? And someone will say, well, we're mad because we're not getting enough attention. And someone else will say, we're mad because the medications have not come online, and etc. So one of the most difficult things, and this is still going to always be true for direct action, is you have to, this is civil rights movement stuff, you have to all agree on one sentence. And whoever gets the microphone pointed at them, they have to say that one sentence, no matter what they personally feel about that day. And you have people that are in wheelchairs, and you have people that are getting the first stage steps of dementia from AIDS, and so we're talking about an extraordinary uplift amongst people that would never otherwise connect. So this is actually quite a gathering. Some of us were there, some of us heard about this and are curious. But, okay, so a couple of stories. The message was always critical. So here we were trying to say, okay, tonight's message is Randalls cannot remove discriminatorily a member of their employee from their employment.
The Steve Little case, we won that in court.
Just to get them out of there, because they developed AIDS, to get them off their insurance. Those things were happening all the time. What we were doing is we were saying, this is who we are. We're going to say who we are. Because what was extraordinary about that time, this is still kind of true, 25, 50 years later, is that there was stuff about gay people on the cover of the newspaper every single day. It was wild. Then it was gay AIDS, sorry. Then it was, in the next decade, it was the military. Now it's marriage. But it's like, well, if everybody's so interested in us, let's tell them about us.
Can I get a member of the panel to respond?
Please.
Thank you very much for your contribution. We appreciate that, and we appreciate your service soldier in the field. Now, one bit of protocol. Paul Varnish has been mentioned a couple of times. Before Paul died, he became a judge. And I'm an old-fashioned guy. Let's refer to him as Judge John Paul Varnish. He earned that title, and judges forever. Anyone want to comment on that?
Actually, I do. You were talking about the circus nature of our organization at times. The meetings were phenomenal. People would come up behind you if you were leading that particular meeting, and they would whisper things, be sure to mention this, be sure to talk about this, or you would be pulled out of the meeting, especially with John Paul, who would say, now I need you to understand this, because I was younger, much younger, and okay, so it was an incredible learning experience. The circus experience was also, it sounds odd, like nothing happened, but it really did. How we creatively came about, how do I say this? We were so creative in our ideas, the way that we did it. I can't take credit, I don't think, for probably any of them, but the Guns N' Roses one outside of the old Summit Compact Center, Brian Bradley, I remember when we were talking what we would do, Brian Bradley said, let's call it Pansies Against Roses. Yeah. To this day, I think that is just the most wonderful title. Now, I know people kind of go, even today, well, that was great on signs. And it was effective, but that kind of creativity, carrying the coffin in the Woodlands March, I don't know, it was just unbelievable. Yes, Rick.
Kristen has asked me to put the microphone back, but before I do that, I want to recognize the gentleman in the Superman shirt.
Well, I just want to ask, how can one get involved with the QFest? And then also, is this digital, these clips, are they going to be available?
He's putting them on the internet, so it's a matter of getting the links.
They're in YouTube.
They're already on
YouTube.
YouTube. Yeah. If you go to
Good question.
Coordination Houston,
They're more extensive than we're going to be able to show here today.
there's like 23 clips in all so far.
So how can one get involved with the QFest more? Like, what if you wanted to do that? How would you do that?
You can volunteer.
Talk to
sign
her,
up.
talk to him.
Yeah, you can talk to us, but volunteering.
Okay. Thank you.
I just want to say one more thing before we go on here. Brian Bradley, bless his heart, of course passed away, I think it was 1995. But Brian was not scared of anybody. When he did that thing with Anita Bryant, you wouldn't have not believed it. The circus atmosphere, I think, as David Miller was mentioned, is because it became so funny to see him do this stuff. He didn't care what anybody said or anybody thought. And the thing he did with David Duke in League City that night was amazing. The Chronicle took that picture of him holding up that banner that said, Nazi go home. And that was the Chronicle's photograph of the year for the paper that year. That photograph of that guy took of Brian doing that. It was all over the nation with this picture of that thing for David Duke. And I do have the original. I will say I kept that.
Good. Archives.
Yes, you do.
Kristen.
So we're going to go ahead because there's a lot of people that want to.
Single, gay, or lesbian person been assigned.
Boy, we were good, weren't we?
When are you going to get back on stage?
I just want to say 2 or 3 things that I think are important. It's important to view what happened in a national context. In 1992, the kind of main Republican message that George Bush was running on was, in the words of the Village Voice, the only thing that America has to fear is queers, tree huggers, and feminists. And so there was an intense national conversation about what was going on. And I think that what was happening with Queer Nation is that there was kind of strong advocacy in that dialogue. I remember during the Republican National Convention on the front page of the New York Times, there was a story that gays and AIDS emerge as key issues in the campaign. And that was when Patrick Buchanan was here in Houston saying there's a cultural war going on in this country, and it's us versus them, us versus the Clintons, and us versus the gays. I also think that it's important to view what was happening with Queer Nation in the context of civil rights movements. In 1963, you had the Freedom Rides, where civil rights workers went to the South, and people felt like they were much too provocative because they were demonstrating to the larger culture what discrimination was like. And my perception is that here in Houston, we were educating the larger culture about gay people are the subject and targets of incredible violence. And it was the same process of consciousness raising and education about this is what it's like to be a gay American in this country. I remember there was a column in the New York Times because HPD put into operation what you saw here, which was called Vice Versa, where they sent cops out on the street of Montrose, and they got beaten up. And this was being written about in the pages of the New York Times, and it suddenly was becoming a point of national discussion. What I also think is important is I remember working on the National Coming Out Day party and listening to the Anita Hill trial or her grilling by the Senate. And I think that what was happening at that moment in American culture was you had a white male heterosexual patriarchy, kind of exemplified by George Bush, that was losing power, and there were suddenly these people like women and gays who were saying, we want a different social order. So I think it's important to see that it wasn't just something happening in Houston, it was part of a much more fractious national dialogue that helped push things forward. One last final thought. My perception of queer nation was, in some ways, representative democracy can have its drawbacks, and my experience was if you were articulate and passionate and you could go before the group and make a good verbal case for something, you could get the group to get behind you and support you. So sometimes it was very much driven around strong personalities who were eloquent and powerful. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, just to begin from where Andrew left off, I completely agree with what you just said. You know, Patrick Buchanan, a far right-wing candidate and a commentator for a long time, he was actually a former advisor under Richard Nixon. He was running for president in 1992. And at the convention in Houston, he gave what was called the infamous culture war speech. And this is when, you know, he went before the GOP and really turned, say, LGBT people into sort of a national issue. And, you know, to my mind, that's when sort of over national political sort of discourse and discrimination against us really becomes like very intense. Because throughout the early 90s, by the second year of the Clinton administration, for example, you have a strong national right-wing reaction around Bill Clinton's attempt to repeal the anti-gay policy in the military. That would eventually turn into Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So the Patrick Buchanan speech at the convention, the culture war speech, was a key moment. Also, speaking more to the sort of broader context that Andrew mentioned, you know, Queer Nation in Houston, we were doing work around AIDS and HIV, we were doing work around queer issues, but there were also a lot of other things that we were doing as well. I think that Queer Nation Houston was more, politically speaking, a sort of broad church organization. We addressed a number of different issues. We participated in different demonstrations, for example. You know, here in Texas and in Houston, obviously, which I think for a long time, and probably still today, executes more people than many countries around the world. There were death penalty cases. We participated in marches and demonstrations around those. There was a case at the time of, I believe, a Mexican national named Ricardo Aldape Guerra. We were involved in some coalition efforts to put together events around protesting basically the sort of police brutality that occurred in Los Angeles in 1992, around the Rodney King beating. And also, another key piece of work that we did was, at the time, you didn't just have sort of the queer movements and the AIDS movement. There's a strong women's movement as well, doing abortion rights work. And at the time, that meant clinic defense. There was a far right-wing organization called Operation Rescue, active nationally. They would travel from one city to another, you know, and sometimes they were able to mobilize hundreds or even thousands of people, and they would blockade abortion clinics. They were in Buffalo, New York in the early 90s. They were actually in Baton Rouge, Louisiana later. They were to come to Houston. They came to Houston in 1992 in August for their Republican convention. So in all of these cities, Buffalo, Baton Rouge, as well as San Francisco, where they had a major clinic defense coalition, they had one in Michigan, they had one in Boston. There was a sort of national movement, you know, within the women's struggle to defend these abortion clinics. And folks around Queer Nation Houston were heavily involved in that on a routine, ongoing basis. I mean, even if Operation Rescue wasn't in town during the convention, there were always anti-choice protesters out in front of different clinics. I recall one very distinctly just off of Chimney Rock, north of 59. So, you know, we were heavily involved in a broad range of issues. I think that films like United in Anger and How to Survive a Plague about ACT UP, they were both released in 2012, are very good. But because they focused on New York, and New York didn't necessarily see a lot of the issues that you saw elsewhere in the country, they tend to make the movement, of which ACT UP and Queer Nation was a part, they tend to make it look more narrow than it actually was.
There was the homeless march out in Parkway Village, and we did the march with Judon Boney's group and several Hispanic groups through River Oaks neighborhoods. I remember joining with those groups and doing that. just to elaborate on what Paul said.
I do want to say one more thing here is that, and somebody mentioned this earlier, that Queer Nation had no officers, no people on the board, or nothing. We just went and every week, like Ray had mentioned, we did switch people that led the meetings, and we did not do a demonstration unless we had unanimous yes votes for it. We had to have 100% people willing to do it. If we had 98, we wouldn't do it. That pissed a lot of people off because they wanted us to do it, but we would not do it. That's how we kept together.
Consensus.
Right, consensus. Not just the majority, but it had to be all of us. If there were 100 people in that room, if everybody but one said, I don't want to do this, we didn't do it. That might sound cruel, but we didn't do it. Because we wanted to keep it, and that really helped us stay focused and stay together on what we really needed to do. You saw what we picked out, they were pretty good, you know, so kept us going.
Well, during that homeless demonstration that was mentioned, the newspaper, the television had a caption, homeless activist, and I said, well, I'm just an activist without a home. Anybody? Yes, sir.
How much interaction was there between the chapters of Queer Nation nationally?
Before the 92 convention, not that I remember. With the 92 convention, there was some working together.
But Paul was the non-officer in charge of that division.
Now, are you talking about relations between the Houston chapter and national, or are you talking about national in general?
Houston and the other chapters.
The first time that we had a lot of visitors to Queer Nation Houston was late 1991. And like I mentioned earlier, folks from ultimately Dallas, Kansas City, Chicago, Seattle, and Los Angeles, and maybe Milwaukee, eventually came down to pay visits to us because we wanted to start planning out their public and national convention. And by the way, these were all ACT UP chapters in those countries, in those cities. I talked to folks with other Queer Nation chapters around the country in doing preparation for the convention. It didn't seem to me that they did as much national coordination on the Queer Nation side. It didn't seem to me they did as much as ACT UP did. ACT UP had national networks. They talked amongst each other much more frequently. And in fact, this is a true story. When these folks from the half dozen cities or so I mentioned came down for the first time, they said, oh wow, y'all are Queer Nation Houston. They had just discovered us somehow, probably through one of the New York Times articles that y'all mentioned. They said, oh, y'all are really great. ACT UP had been distributing money out of New York through their national network, money that had been raised through a set of CDs called the Red Hot and Blue CDs. Yeah. They were compilations. The profits from those CDs went to AIDS organizations, including ACT UP. And so they had distributed to a lot of ACT UP chapters around the country, but they had just ignored us because we call ourselves Queer Nation and because we were in Houston. And Houston, at the time, and I got this impression very strongly, it was sort of like on the periphery of things. People didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what we were doing prior to that point. And that's both positive and negative. So anyway, we lost out on a whole bunch of money that they were distributing because they had no idea who we were or what we were doing. So, we definitely had closer relations with them through the end of 1991 and 1992. But yeah, so we actually did a lot of work in prepping for the convention with other ACT UP chapters around the country.
So was there an ACT UP Houston?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what we're seeing on television. All of us were ACT UP.
Yeah, David Fowler mentioned a bit back that there was an ACT UP Houston chapter, which David, I believe, formed in around 1988.
Yeah, well, yeah, right after the convention.
There's ACT UP Gulf Coast.
Right, and so ACT UP Houston didn't really work out for reasons David hinted at. And so that's when Queer Nation Houston was created. Now there was another chapter, which David Embry just mentioned, of ACT UP formed, I believe in late 1992, called ACT UP Gulf Coast. So, and I would say the Queer Nation Houston was always it was definitely the largest organization.
Yeah.
We had between 200 or 300 members. That's the number of people on our mailing and phone list.
Show up at a meeting.
70 or 80 people at a meeting. I'm not sure that the ACT UP chapters on either side of us really, they were not that large.
And I don't think ACT UP could have handled any of the money we got it because we didn't have the structure here. And you didn't have the 501c3, and I think all that's required. But it was a rubber meets the road organization. Now, I wasn't active at going to meetings and things. I went there a couple of times and asked for their help. Fortunately, I got that consensus to get it, and whatever was planned or hoped for happened. But Queer Nation in Houston was the best example I can think of in a mere 44 years of activism of a grassroots, radically democratic organization whose membership had equal value in making the decision. Everything else I have dealt with in 44 years has been hierarchical. There have been officers that quarreled over those positions, and a lot of energy is wasted there, have been burdened with a lot of structure. It was like Queer Nation in Houston was people who cared a lot about one another and the rest of the community to show up, sometimes make an absolute fool of themselves, to get attention and to bring change. I'm going to take a couple of more questions and we're going to break up, and I hope you will talk to one another for a while. Yes, sir.
My question is, I want to know, with the varying factions of the community, gay male, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, how did all of these groups work together within the organization? And in particular, I'm kind of interested how involved the trans community was in the movement.
It's actually an excellent couple of meetings, and then the next meeting showed up fully female. And
Sara.
Sarah. Yeah, lovely, lovely. And even though there were more men in the organization, there were women. I felt very good in the group. We were listened to. I know that Michael Crawford came to a lot of the meetings. I mean, it was racially not incredibly mixed, but we had all voices. We all spoke. We all got angry with each other. We all somehow figured this all out. But I was quite pleased that a transgender community started to come to our meetings too. In fact, I will quickly share this. One of the most heartbreaking scenes to me, and how I still had some learning to do, was when Sara was one of the leaders at one of the Randall's protests, and it was an issue about the restrooms, the choice of restrooms. And there was a second leader of our group for that particular action who shook the officers' hands, talked with them, and when she went forward to shake their hands, they absolutely refused to shake her hand. And I was standing there, it broke my heart. And I still get kind of choked up even thinking about it, because I thought, oh God, we've got work to do. And of course the line was, we leave no one behind. You know, so it was a good representative group, and we did have our voices. I wish that more women had shown up, but we worked with the NOW organization, like Paul mentioned, Planned Parenthood issues. We worked with the Black community, Hispanic community. So I don't want to make it sound like it was perfect, but I was very comfortable in the group. I liked working with the guys.
I would like to mention...
Quick follow-up. Oh yeah, go ahead please.
At the Take Back the Streets rally, we did have a list of demands. And it was John Burgo who got up and read those lists of demands. And I think it addresses this question. And the demands were, we wanted proper classification by HPD of hate crimes and vigorous prosecutions of such crimes by the District Attorney's Office. We wanted immediate implementation of sensitivity training for HPD officers on working with women, racial and ethnic minorities, and gays and lesbians. We demanded the hiring of gay and lesbian police officers. And we demanded a commitment by HPD and the press to protect confidentiality of hate crimes victims, which was currently being done for rape victims. But we did work with other communities, and when we made our demands, we always included those communities as well.
The previous mentioned Randall's issue. Ultimately, Randall Olmsted surrendered. There were no officers of Queer Nation to go out and accept the sword. So they called me, somebody called me, maybe it was Randall, called me and said, meet me at the office. And so I carried Sara with me, and I carried Randy Fields with me, little firebrand. And so we went out to see Randall Olmsted. He came downstairs because he had been up on the roof making a commercial. And he had on more makeup than Sara. And he didn't realize that until 50% through the thing. We had won the case in the appellate court. Stephen Little was paid damages for his firing. And so when it came time for his health had begun to fail, so when it came time to surrender, I took great pride in being there when Randall Olmsted had on more eyeshadow than Sara. And we accepted the sword graciously, and things have been different. They've since sold to Safeway, I understand. It's a big international corporation. Thank you very much for your question. One more. Yes, sir.
I just want to give a shout out to Susanna Anderson in terms of women who were leaders in the queer nation
And Diane
movement.
Williams.
She was a very successful Houston realtor. She had a show on KPFT, Queer Voices, and she also, I don't know if it came out of her queer nation experience, started an organization, Lesbians in Business, that gave the female community a great place to come together and to network. And it seemed like, I don't remember the exact chronology, but that queer nation and this increased consciousness led to these other things happening. The formation of Q Patrol to kind of control the Montrose area around the bars, to watch for anti-gay people who wanted to commit anti-gay violence. So it was like there was this huge catalyst coming. Queer Nation was a huge catalyst for all these other groups, like Lesbians in Business, like Q Patrol. And for me, I think it's important to understand, in the same way that in the 1960s civil rights movement, you had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP representing the establishment, then you had sort of on the far fringes, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Panthers. For me, the Houston Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus was the establishment, and Queer Nation were the kind of Black Panthers of the LGBT movement here in Houston. And both those sides of the kind of movement play a really significant role in pushing change forward, in negotiating with the power structure, but also in being very confrontational and challenging.
FYI, Suzanne Anderson, usual spelling, is alive and outspoken on Facebook.
Yes, she is.
She is.
I love you all. Thank you for coming. I want to thank QFest. You just let me, I'll give it to you. You can close it up. I want to thank QFest for thinking, having the kind of forward vision to have this discussion to have. And of course, I want to thank Montrose Center for being your usual gracious hosts.
Once again, I'm undershadowed by Ray. That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you, QueerFest, for letting us come in today.
I've been stealing your lines for a few years now.
You didn't get me out of the house after 20 years, but I also want to thank some of my straight friends that came with me, Kim, Bonnie, and David, who came out to support me on this. And I have a lot, for some reason, I have a lot of straight friends also. I guess that's good.
That is
very good.
Anyway, thank you, QFest, for doing this, and the Montrose Center for having us here today. And thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.
Can we have housewives?